Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're listening from. This is Michael Cross with another episode of Unlocked Door Radio, where we try to deal with subjects of a challenging nature to get people to think outside the box and consider aspects of living today that maybe before they had never given much thought to. Tonight's episode is the weaponization of psychology. Now you're probably thinking, what the heck is the weaponization of psychology? What is that all about? Well, essentially this. Psychology, I believe, is something that most of us think back to our high school days when we had to take that one psychology course because it was required. And yeah, it probably wasn't as exciting as we thought it was going to be. I mean, in high school, you're thinking, we're going to study crazy people in institutions and some of the really weird stuff out there. And then you wound up having to, get some article from your teacher about relationships or maybe there was something about what causes this one individual to go out and rob a bank or something. But it wasn't really that exciting. And then maybe a few more of you got into college and you had at least the introduction to psychology, which mostly dealt with theories and probably dealt with people like Freud, Jung, Skinner, Maslow, Erickson, those psychological pioneers. And you got a little bit deeper than you would have in high school. You were able to see how psychology theories may contradict one another, but ultimately try to give some explanation as to why people do the things they do. Now, I will note before I go on here, psychology mostly deals with the individual's relationship to society. Now, of course, you have group psychology, which deals with when you get a bunch of individuals and how that affects a society. But that's contrasted with sociology, which tends to look at life as a collective unit, a society. And I still remember back in college when I had one professor, he would get up on the table and scream and yell about how sociology was not actually a science and ultimately psychology was. I'll get into some of the differences between sociology and psychology because actually they're very profound. They are very profound and may explain why sometimes you hear people, politicians, educators, so forth, they say something about, well, we need to have these kinds of policies, and you're going, what? What has that got to do with anything? Well, those are usually influenced more by the sociological model, but I'll get into that. Anyway, psychology. The one person you often think of when you're thinking about psychology is Sigmund Freud. That iconic picture you often see out there on blogs and on the internet of the old Freud when he was older, had the trimmed beard, and was holding a cigar. And of course the joke is, what's a cigar represent? And the thing I find is very interesting is that Freud's views are often treated more like his history versus science. And people are quick nowadays to dismiss Freud and say, well, his views were something that were developed during the Victorian era. Freud's been dead for like 70 or 80 years now, and we know so much more about how humans interact with other humans and develop and so forth. You may not realize, though, that the higher you go up in psychology, the more his theories about the subconscious do come into play. And, of course, if you go into marketing and some of these other areas, even things like the film industry, you'll find that Freud's views are actually quite important. Because what they are is, at least, let me just say this. Some of Freud's views, I think, may have been the product of him really overanalyzing a situation or an event or even objects. But ultimately, his view of what motivates human beings is very important. And if you're going to actually combat some of the problems in today's society, whether they be the way individuals think, things in your family, things in the community, and even at the national level, when you're trying to expose things for what they really are, you gotta know something about Freud. You gotta know what motivates people to do what they do. And ultimately, it's not a factor of such things as the intellect. It's not listening to something and going, yeah, that makes sense. That's what you want to believe, but ultimately, it's emotions that affect us. Now, let's take a look at what Freud believed affects us the most. Well, ultimately, it's sex. But it goes deeper than that. It goes deeper than that. Freud believes that the human mind is very similar to a 2-year-old. And what happens is that core, the 2-year-old, is still ultimately what's behind the mechanism, what's behind you. It's your ego. Now, let me give you this analogy. Here's the analogy. You've got a child sitting on one of those plastic, I don't even know, do they allow those in the United States anymore? Because I thought that kids weren't allowed to really do anything anymore in the United States, or the parents get arrested. But anyway, you take them on those 3-wheel plastic tricycle-looking toys, and they fly around the cul-de-sac or whatever and play. And if you ask this 2 or 3-year-old what they're doing, well, they'll just say they're playing and having a good time, and you kind of think, well, okay, that 2-year-old is in charge of his or her little vehicle. Now, think of the vehicle. It slips my mind what they call those again. But think of that vehicle as the human self, and the toddler or 2 or 3-year-old as being the innermost subconscious of this mechanism. Just say it's the object that's flying around the cul-de-sac. Now, it's pretty easy to see that the 2 or 3-year-old is really in charge of that. But now let's pretend we then take the 2 or 3-year-old and we stick them in a race car. Now, of course, we don't let them race around the track or anything, but they have the potential that if they were to turn the engine on and were to be able to reach down and push the pedals, that race car would go flying around. And it would be no different as a vehicle than the plastic tricycle that the kid was playing on originally. But if you saw it from a distance during some period when it was actually traveling down the racetrack and, not crashing and burning, you would think that, okay, well, that's an advanced race car that's being operated. Well, yes, it is. But ultimately, what's behind it is still a 2 or 3-year-old. Now, think about that in human sense when it comes to the way we interact with society. When you were 2 or 3 years old, you had this body that eventually developed, became an adult. Your brain developed and gained skills in interaction. But you know what? The emotional part is still the 2 or 3-year-old. The emotional part is still governed to a large degree by I want, I crave, or beyond that even by instincts. They're survival instincts. I mean, ultimately when we go out, if you think about it, human beings still are engaged in survival. It's just nowadays, instead of going out and killing a rabbit and dragging it home, for, the family to cook up for dinner, you go out, you do work, you exchange those units of work for money, And then you take money and you could go to the store and buy a rabbit if you wanted to, or whatever is in the meat section. And while that may sound more civilized, it really isn't. I mean, we're still engaged in that. And ultimately, we've replaced our hunters with people that work on factory farms, growing thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pigs or chickens or cows or whatever. And they do the job of killing them and cutting them up and sending them to market. Still, though, we're still involved in it. Okay, so human technology advances just like the human body advances, but ultimately the instincts and the survival needs have not changed at all. Okay, they're no different. You could be someone who flies a space shuttle, but you're no different biologically than some person that's a member of some tribe out in the outermost areas of the Amazon forest who's never worn clothes and goes out and gathers, bulbs and kills a monkey or something, and that's what they eat. No difference whatsoever, just different toys, different things to work with. So, anyway, Freud recognized that the human being is still governed by the same processes that any other living creature is. Otherwise, well, the species wouldn't survive, would it? Ultimately, governed by sex and sex urges. I'll throw those into instincts. Security. You're going to want to have security in order to survive. And a sense of belonging. And so, any mixed aggressiveness in there as a means of getting a lot of these things. So essentially, those things exist in the human psyche. And they're no real, again, not that much different than most higher animals, really, even many of the lower animals. But we have been given extra. We do have, if you're religious, you believe that our souls are more defined, have a different purpose than maybe the spirits, if you believe in the spirits for other living things. Humans are special. Humans are unique. But still, they have these things. I don't care. No matter what person does, you take someone, and what did the Catholic Church used to do? They used to castrate young men and so that they could sing in the choirs back a few hundred years ago. Well, even if you did that, you still can't get rid of all of those urges that exist in human beings. And so the same is true of no matter how advanced our society or civilization is, we're still governed by a lot of these urges, although we learn how to control them. Now, the thing is, if we understand this about the human psyche, if we understand that much of what we do is done for reasons that we don't understand and may in fact be masking things that we don't really want to admit to, then we can understand that manipulation does take place, and we also could understand how it takes place. All right, so essentially, Freud's talked about things like this. Why do women like to receive roses or something like that? Well, maybe, they're pretty or whatever. It could be ultimately, though, and this goes a little bit more into Carl Jung and symbolism and stuff, but it could be that the flowers are the reproductive organ of the plant. And there is a connection made in the back of someone's mind of what those really mean. So, therefore, we don't talk about it. We don't sell roses, get your significant other to agree to sex. Buy them these roses. We wouldn't say it. We use subtle things. We talk about romance. We talk, because it's more civilized to talk about romance and to use nice terms for it. Well, anyway, I'm diverging off there. I just want to say this. If we're ultimately driven by the subconscious, then to learn what those subconscious drives are is crucial in protecting ourselves from the people that would want to stick their hands into our minds and remold us, to reshape us. Okay? You don't want that to happen. So, let's think about a few things here in society. Now, first of all, before I get into this Freud stuff, I want to quote a very influential individual. And let me see, I may have accidentally clicked it down here. That's okay. Anyway, I can paraphrase. If anyone's ever heard of Bertrand Russell, very intelligent individual, extremely intelligent individual. That doesn't mean I like everything he had to say, because ultimately Bertrand Russell seems to present a blueprint for how society could be run by the elite. Now, the thing is, we have to recognize that most of what we have out there, and Edward Bernays, by the way. Oh, Edward Bernays. Do you know who his uncle was? Make a guess. Okay, time's up. Sigmund Freud. Okay, his uncle was Sigmund Freud. I think they were also cousins too, but that's complicated. But anyway, Bertrand Russell had this idea that, at least it seems, that his belief was that humans would be better run by the elite. And this is very similar to the psychologist B.F. Skinner. And I mean, this idea can go all the way back to Plato, who believed that the perfect society would be one in which a group called the Guardians would be in charge, and that ultimately it takes the average person doesn't know what they really need in order to survive and to cause a society to thrive. What you need is people who are more intelligent, people who are able to study science and literature and all those kinds of things, like Plato's Guardians, and be able to make decisions for the human mass in general. So the elite idea, ultimately, is that if you can influence human behavior by subtle means, use a lot of, well, I would say manipulation. They would probably call it something else, some sort of leadership. But the idea would be that you steer society from behind the scenes, like Edward Bernays said. Edward Bernays did say that most of our taste, values, beliefs, preferences are ultimately determined by people we've never met, never seen, much less ever heard of. And so, who would those people be? Well, you could think of people that are in charge of institutions that do research on human behavior. You could think of it as people that are in the media. I'm not talking about the ones you see, on TV, but the people who actually write the scripts for those people, the people that own the stations, the corporations, I should say, and also those who are in charge of higher education. And again, I'm not talking about your teachers or your principals or something, but people who are at the various state and national levels who are determining what takes place. They're the ones that write the studies, the curriculums, and so forth. So anyway, some of the things where they have to aim at is trying to get people to behave in an appropriate manner, but while they're acting in that appropriate manner, to also believe that they're the ones who came up with the idea in the first place. So that's why I say it's manipulation. It's more effective to come out and create a societal norm than it would be to try to teach people to live that societal norm. Now, how do you do that? How do you get people to change their ways without them actually knowing it? Well, I'd center on such thing. The first thing I will say, and I think it's very, very important to look at this area, is when it comes to reproduction. The one thing that causes the distress of the elite the most is reproduction. And I think it's very easy to see that. You can see the kinds of scare tactics and warnings and so forth. I don't think you can pick up any high school biology book. Even in the United States, where the birth rate's lower than it ever has been per capita because of the economy and so forth, and I'll get into that in a moment, you can't pick up a textbook that won't talk about the evils of human growth. You turn on the TV and you're watching animal shows. And a lot of these animal documentaries, the first thing they'll do, oh yes, this animal's losing its habitat because of human growth. You'll see other documentaries in recent years. Oh, global warming is going to cause this. And it's not even global warming may cause this, or if global warming does this, then this happens. No, it's global warming will. And that's very important psychologically. Because if you use the word may or if in describing anything, and I'm using global warming as an example, then you create in the person's subconscious this picture of maybe a person walking up to a road and there's two directions. One direction says if global warming takes place. The other one is what happens if global warming takes place. But if you use the word when and is instead, even though it's not proven, then what you do is you create this image that this is something that there's no divergence in the road. There is a straight path from point A to point B. It's going to happen. It's been proven. You don't have to cite studies. And I'll note there's studies that suggest global warming is taking place and that it's human-made. There are studies that suggest global warming is taking place, but humans are only one variable in the equation. The sun could also be involved. Volcanic activity, even, or lack of, can be involved in the process. And then there's the view, and there's studies to support the idea that global warming really is not taking place anyway, whatsoever. But if you even hint of the existence of anything that would question the narrative, then the acceptance of the narrative decreases dramatically. So therefore, it's very important from a propaganda point of view, regardless of what your issue is, to state something is going to happen and just stick with that narrative. I think Hitler even said something to that effect. For propaganda to be most effective, you have to say something simple and continue saying it and repeating it so it becomes accepted that must be true. The thing that should be remembered, though, is that Hitler, at least according to what I've read about Goebbels, much of the propaganda in the Nazi regime was actually based on findings that were presented by people like Bernays. Very ironic there, but it is true that ultimately the model for propaganda can be used one way or another. It's not like propaganda is always for a lie or propaganda is always for good. It's just the way it's used. It's a weapon. And psychology then can be used as a weapon as well. But anyway, back on the reproduction. Now, Freud believed that humanity was based on an idea that boy grows up, girl grows up, gets married, has a family, and continues the whole complicated process of human development. And for humans to survive well with each other, they have to repress their natural inclinations to do bad. If everyone went out and, it didn't matter if they saw a wedding ring on a woman's hand or not, or vice versa, when women, it didn't matter whatsoever if they saw a wedding ring on a man's finger, and they just found that person attractive and didn't care, and immediately went into the art of seduction on that person. Well, just there alone, this would create a chaotic situation. It would break down marital bonds. It would cause a situation. I don't care what some people may say. Well, yeah, but there's swingers over here and their divorce rate's low and stuff like that. You're talking about a microcosm. Freud would say that if we look at the society as a whole, if everyone just suddenly started just living on their impulse, in that respect even, that it would create disorder. Now you can just think about it, because you still have jealousy, so you would have situations where people would be getting revenge and that sort of thing. Many of them, not all, but many. And then if we looked at it like, well, if everyone decided to just kind of do what they pleased when it came to, if you see something on your neighbor's lawn and you like it, just go over and take it. You see, that is not happening to a large degree, because human beings, through the very complicated process of growing up and introjecting the values of the society and of their parents and of their religion and so forth, they don't do these things. They don't go out and just take what they want when they want, whether that's other partners or the neighbor's property or whatever. Now, ultimately, this very complex web of societal norms allows a society to maintain a sense of well-being, a sense of continuity, a sense of, well, everyone knowing what's right and what's wrong. And most people won't challenge that in any way, shape, or form. They'll just live it. And if they do something that goes against those norms, most of them will feel guilt for doing it, and they won't do it anymore. Or, they'll feel punished by themselves, even the policeman in the head, for doing it. Now, Wilhelm Reich was one of Freud's star students, and he was more left-wing, and he wanted to challenge the society at the core. And ultimately, what he felt was that if you could overturn the Freudian model, switch it over onto itself, you could actually bring down the society and rebuild it in some sort of utopian socialistic dream. Now, I'm going to go into him later on another show, but ultimately, much of the left of the 1960s and 1970s, who had found that they were not successful in breaking the society through protest and through other things, were able to much of the left was able to achieve their goals through basically, yes, turning over Freud. I'm trying to simplify this here, but by challenging the dominant social structure, they were able then to cause the society to reverse and people to question not just, well, is it right for me not to have sex before I'm married, but that got extended over to, well, is the dominant social structure the norm that I have to follow when it comes to the economy or to marriage and family or to these other things. So, but anyway, I'm going to go into Reich in a lot more detail. But I will have to say this, though. If we think about how how psychology has been used to turn things around. If we look at how Freud believed that human beings were programmed to have children, Freud had a big family, by the way. So did Darwin, I might add. Then what can you do to get people not to have as many kids? Now, you could go out and you could make all kinds of claims. Oh my gosh, the world is so overpopulated. We're all going to die. Remember the movie Soylent Green and a lot of other films of that era where the dystopian model was that everyone was, there was too many people in the future, and that everyone would be starving and society would collapse on itself because of this. Well, ultimately, we can see that that's pretty much not the case. Populations of many countries have grown, and their prosperity has grown too. But it doesn't seem to stop the population control people. So, how do you get people who they have a very strong desire to have families? That's built into us. It's hardwired into us not to have families. Well, one way is to tap into what they believe, and this has been done through many studies, many focus groups. You start asking people, for instance, do you want a family? And they say yes. And then you ask, well, what do you think would be ideal for your children? Well, to get a good education. Okay, well, to get a good education. So what do you mean by that? And you find out, well, I didn't go to college, but I'd love for my kids to go to college. Okay, well, then what you do is you know that they really want to have a family. So then you turn it around and say, if you want to have the family and you want it to be prosperous, you want your child to have more than you, then maybe what you need to do is limit your family to only one kid, because then you'll be able to afford more things for your family. You'll be able to get more things. You'll be able to save up a lot of money to send that one child to the college or university that you really want. So even though this person may feel like, well, my gosh, I really loved growing up with maybe 2 other brothers or 2 sisters or whatever, maybe that should be sacrificed so that I can give everything to this baby that I just have and make sure that he or she has a better life than I did in these other areas, because I really wish I could have had all these other things that my friends did. So what you've done is you've taken an ideal, something that's admirable. Okay, I want to have a family. I want to have children. And then you've also found that what motivates that person is which is also admirable, I want the best for my children. And then you reconfigure that way of thinking. You go in kind of like a cognitive behavioral therapy strategy. You go in and you get that person to feel that if they do go ahead and have more than one kid, they won't be able to do that second thing, to give all these wonderful things to my family. So what you've done then is now you have helped to convince that person, not through telling them that they shouldn't have kids, because a lot of times people just say, yeah, whatever. But and they may even know about demographics. They may even know that, hey, wait a minute, the population's on decline right now. My having this 3 or 4 kids is not going to hurt anyone, because there's a lot of people out there who can't or won't have kids in the first place. And it's still going to be a demographic decline. But at the personal level, if you can get them to really focus on that one materialistic point, they will then alter their values, and then they will conform to what you want them to conform to. And this has been done. I read an article years ago when Italy was going through its demographic transition that, normally you had this stereotype of these big Italian families in Italy, at least 3 or 4 kids, or a lot of times more. And now Italy has like the lowest birth rate on earth. It's like one kid per family, which of course means half as many Italians in the future once the older generation dies off. Takes a while, but it will happen eventually. Well, the thing is that the article I was reading when this was really taking place was saying that the most effective tool to get Italian families to cut back to only one or two kids at that time was the whole materialism thing. But it wasn't presented negatively. It wasn't like, oh, spoil your kid, do this. It was more like provide for your children and have less kids so that you can provide more for the one or two that you do have. And that's very powerful, because what you're doing is you're still talking to the subconscious. It's still a feeling. It's an emotion that's going to surround your concept of the family. And then what's interesting is the next generation, you've won already. You don't even have to really reinforce the message that much, because now that you've created a situation now where they've grown up with more money, more goodies, they could never imagine not doing the same for their children. And so therefore, you see a situation in Italy today where the birth rate has actually gone down to, like I said, 1 on the average. Because then they're not going to, very few are willing to think, okay, well, you know what, I'm going to be just like grandma and have 4 kids. Because then you're thinking, well, grandma's 4 kids great-grandma, I should say, his 4 kids didn't have as much. And I'm not going to do that to my kids. So ultimately, this is why I believe that in the countries where you have 1 or 2 kids as the norm, you're going to see an acceleration of birth rate decline the next generation. It's not a stabilization, and you only have rare cases where someone says, you know what, I know a couple of people who were raised as only kids, and they decide, you know what, no way, I'm not going to have that life for my family. I'm going to have like 7 or 8 kids. I don't know that many. I know a couple, but I don't know that many. And it's far less than would be needed to offset that. But it's still effective. It's still very, very effective to use to get people to do what you want them to do. And they don't even realize it. You ask them, why aren't you going to have more kids? Well, that's just how many we've decided we're going to have. Have you really decided it? Or did Edward Bernays hit it more on the hammer, on the nail, and say that most decisions in society have been made by someone else, someone far more influential at another level of society. So anyway, there's other techniques, of course, you can use too when it comes to reproduction to get people to have less kids, besides do you really have enough money? And that is to create an expectation in the society for marriage rates and marriage ideals and when you should get married and so forth. If you take a look at Northern Europe, for instance, the most women, for instance, from Sweden and stuff like that, they don't even start thinking about marriage until they're like 30. Now, many do, of course, but the most of them, they're not married. And if you ask them, I'm not ready yet. Okay, 30 used to be the age where parents would be looking at their daughter, especially, thinking, oh my gosh, is she ever going to get married and have kids? And it's been switched now, and I think a large part of it because of media, a large part of it because of education, creating this image that you don't want to be like the oppressed women of your great grandmother's era. You want to achieve this and this and this. You want to travel the world. And ultimately even goes into things like, well, do you really want to be someone that's only had one significant relationship? Isn't it better to have experienced life? And why just stop at one guy? Maybe this guy, this girl, this guy. and experience everything there is to experience. And then you start feeling like you're starting to slow down, get a little older, time to get married. And then of course by that time I was reading this article. It's related to this. It was called 50 is the new 30. 30 is the new 50. I'm sorry. Talking about women, that a lot of times the 30 plus age males, they start feeling like, my gosh, mortality is starting to catch up with me too. And so they decide to start becoming a little bit more serious about their dating. And they'll drop their 35-year-old girlfriend and they'll go find a 23-year-old and get married and start a family. Of course, leaving this big group, this big demographic of 35, let's say 35-year-old-ish women who've only got a little bit of time left reproductively. And, basically many of them will never have kids. And if they do opt for a sperm bank or something, they usually only have one kid. So this norm is starting to take hold in the society. And again, it's something that's really reinforced with media, where you have all your sitcoms and your movies from Hollywood. By the way, they don't just get played in America. This pollution of the Hollywood ethic and so forth, this American culture, well, it's not even really American culture, it's a fake culture, but of course everyone sees it as America outside of the United States. This fake culture goes out, and come on, I was in a really remote area of China one time, and there was a popular American cartoon series playing in the restaurant that I was in. When I say remote, this place was remote. Okay, China's pretty advanced in the cities and most of the mid-sized communities, but this was out in the middle of freaking nowhere, where when the lights went out, there weren't that many places that actually had lights at night. So if you were out and you hadn't gotten to the hotel yet, which is one of the few areas that actually did have lights, it was pretty. You better have a flashlight on the main street to be able to find your place. So, but still, the TVs that they had, that American culture right there. But it's very powerful. If we give this, take a look at your average chick flick on TV, or movies or whatever, or a lot of the primetime shows. You got a lot of people, the main heroines of American cultural TV movies don't have family, and they're still in their mid-30s. And this creates an image where someone looks in the mirror, back in, 1975, they look in the mirror when they're 25 going, oh my gosh, maybe I should get serious about, looking for someone to find a relationship and hopefully get married and have a family. And nowadays it's more like 35 before that happens. Well, I guess if you're a guy, it's not so bad, but if you're a girl, you got a pretty good chance you're going to be buying some kitty cats when you hit 40 to keep you company. And of course, the media presents this idea that, do you really have enough time? If you're young and you want to get married and have a family, well, are you sure? Aren't you a little young for that? If you're older and you want to start a family, it's like, well, maybe 38's a little old to be starting a family. Are you sure you want to do that? Then they throw in things about freedom, so forth. See, this is all a psychology that Freud would be able to understand and explain very well. That you go in and you find out what the person really desires in life, and then you use these different desires against each other, either to modify the desire or to eliminate the desire. But just coming out and saying, well, you shouldn't have so many kids, not very effective. You can look at subgroups in the United States. You can look at, for instance, I would say Mormons. If you look at back in the 70s, the Mormon birth rate was really high. even though there's all of this propaganda, oh my gosh, zero population, we got to have less kids, and we got to do this and this and this, but yet it didn't affect the Mormon birth rate. But given a generation later, when you've got the prevailing culture out there with its norms and values, its artificial norms and values, I should say, that emphasize all these things, you see that the Mormon birth rate has gone down. Still higher than the average in the United States, but it's still gone down at the same rate as that of the general population. It just started higher in the first place. Has the values of their church changed? No, they still teach that you should have kids. Has there been more propaganda saying, oh my gosh, we're all going to die, if people have kids? We got to save Mother Gaia Earth, that sort of thing. Has that increased? No, in fact, it's actually decreased. At least if you're talking about the general media, you don't see those kind of commercials that many of you grew up on, showing the baby and saying, oh my gosh, if we have many of these, we're not going to have anywhere to breathe, or something like that. No, that's actually decreased. But what's more effective is the more subtle types of behavioral control, just like using soap operas down in South America. Population control groups have been very influential in getting soap operas to show the message of having fewer children. And when that becomes the case, that Freudian concept of belonging, that is very important, especially for women, to belong to the community, that concept has been altered to where all of a sudden now, if you have more than that, then you're in some way not really part of the community anymore. I knew someone who, she was pregnant with her third child. She told me that when she found out she was pregnant and realized that, oh my gosh, all of my social group that I'm with, they're going to look at me like some sort of really strange person, she went out and had an abortion. She was really into environmentalism too and stuff. It wasn't until later that she felt like, I really wish I had not had that abortion. But she said that it was the norms of her peers, her community, that caused her to feel guilt. And so this is another thing. If you're worried that your kids are going to pick up values from the rest of the society, then you got to realize the superego, that part of the brain, according to Freud, that causes us to feel guilt, the part that says this is right and this is wrong. You've got to be able to make sure that that person knows exactly where the messages are coming from the society that you don't like. If you tell your kids, you're a good Christian family growing, Arkansas or something, and you want your kids not to have sex outside of marriage, but yet the TV shows present it in such a way that you face it. Tell me right now, if you're listening to this, you've never watched a show in which the leading man and leading woman, you weren't cheering when they finally got in bed together. Emotionally, you were thinking, oh, finally they're together. You know what? On James Bond movies, does he get married to these women he's with? But yet, I don't think there's probably any difference between... In fact, I would actually say conservative people are more likely to watch James Bond movies than liberal ones. A lot of times the liberal ones might be too feministic and don't like it. But think about that emotional message that the society has given. As long as you care for the person, and of course on the TV show it's got nice music and it's the perfect atmosphere and all this kind of stuff, and they've gotten this tension built up the whole time. Now, you don't think your kids are susceptible to that if you cognitively feel that way? Well, you can go tell them, you should not have relations before marriage. Well, that's nice to tell them. But unless you inform them of the psychology, the society, the values that they want, and the techniques they will use to get you to lower your guard and change your values, then you're fighting a losing cause. So therefore, you've really got to go deep. You've got to know, you've got to understand the whole concepts of psychology, or you're going to be susceptible to it. And if not you, your family. So you just think about that for a moment. Now, I did say the thing about women having a sense of belonging being more crucial to women than men. And I'm basing a little bit of that on the notion of evolutionary psychology, but of course it's not a foreign concept to psychology in general. Women tend to want to do things that will bring them more sense of community. I think this is the reason for the gender gap. You know, why more women vote for Democrats than for Republicans, because women are more susceptible to the, well, do we want to have good schools for everyone? Even if they don't have kids, they may be feeling like, yeah, you know, I see those children, they're part of our society. Now, Freud, of course, talked in his writing, Civilization and Its Discontents, that human beings' ego gets projected out onto society. And so we create a false sense of belonging. Whether that's to our general society, we feel like, well, I'm from this country, so therefore this is the way I should be. And you have that sense that everyone should recognize it's kind of like a big family. Or it could be like everyone who's a fan of a particular TV show, be it, I don't know, Game of Thrones, Walking Dead, whatever. Or a fan of a certain group like One Direction or Miley Cyrus or something like that. The fans will project out onto other fans because you want to feel like you've got a sense of belonging. Well, even a single, especially woman, will have this sense of, yes, I want the children of our society to have what's right and what's good. And so a Democrat comes along and talks in that language. All of a sudden, it's like, yeah, I like him or her. They care about kids. A Republican that doesn't have kids, you know, a guy's more likely to say, well, I don't have any kids in school, why should I work? You know, that sort of thing. And be more likely to vote for someone who's libertarian or Republican in order to cut taxes and so forth. But women tend to want to conform more to the society. They want to, it's a function. If you look at any primitive tribe of people, it's the women who are more closed as a group and usually have various rituals and so forth. I knew, and usually we'll try to preserve those rituals and ideas. I'll venture to say this: if a woman decides not to shave her legs or underarms, it's not really going to affect that many men. I mean, seriously, it's not going to. You may say, "Oh, yeah." Now, if a woman with hairy underarms comes on to a guy, there's not too many guys that are going to run the other direction. Okay, but who will be the ones that challenge it? I knew a woman who decided to do this a while back, and her father was kind of like, "Yeah, whatever." I mean, when they went to the beach, she's like in her mid-20s. But her mother was the one going, "Oh my gosh, how can you be?" You know, and she came off on her. So the thing is, women try to preserve this kind of sense of community. Advertisers know that. Advertisers know that if they can hit women on security, you're not good enough. You're not beautiful enough. You don't wear the right clothes. You don't drive the right car. You don't do this. If you're a career woman, oh my gosh, don't you wish you had a kid? If you're a mother at home, well, don't you wish you were out there in the career world? That kind of thing. Is it any freaking wonder why 90% of women feel that they have an unattractive body? That's at least, maybe it's a feminist organization I heard that from, but still 90% feel that they have an unattractive body. I wonder what would happen if suddenly we got hit with some sort of EMP pulse or something, burst, and it would shut down all of our media, all of our TVs, and so forth, social media especially. What would happen? I think women's self-esteem would go up. I think it would go up a lot. I would venture, I'm just saying this, I don't have any scientific study, but I'll bet you women that live in like remote areas of Afghanistan where they wear burqas probably have a higher self-esteem than the average Western woman wearing her her fancy designer clothes and with a designer purse and designer this and designer that. I'll bet you if you took a self-esteem inventory on the two groups, you would find the women living, that area where, well, geez, what's there to show off? If you got a burqa on, well, they probably have better self-esteem. Because our society, we've told women that they have to be really worried. You don't want to sweat, you don't want to smell, you don't want to, miss a spot of hair that might be on some part of your body. You've got to have this much money. You don't want to be a failure. You've got to make sure that you're the smartest, most attractive, most this of anyone out there. Is it any wonder many of them just give up and just like, whatever, I'm gonna go, just forget it. Just go down to the store and buy a lot of junk food and that sort of thing. Or just like, well, I don't want to be this or that, or I shouldn't shoot for higher goals and so forth. If you hit people with this kind of message that is messing with their sense of security as part of the body, as part of their community, to where it threatens themselves, then you're going to cause a lot of unhappiness and depression. And it doesn't matter whether you're religious, non-religious, whatever. It's the same story because you live in that society. In fact, even if you're religious, it might be worse because you're trying to set a good example for other people. So all of a sudden now society not only is telling you have to be perfect here, 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 and here, but you believe that if you're not perfect, you've got to feel even more guilty because someone might see your messy yard or your messy house and think, I don't know what it is about those Christians or those this or this or this, that you don't want them to be thinking negatively about you, so you're going to be super perfect. Well, that's not exactly going to be good for people. And so what's happened is, I guess, one of the things about Bertrand Russell, is he did say, in the future we'll have a society where because of education, because of pharmaceuticals, and because of basic control of the media, you won't need to have a totalitarian state to get people to do what you want them to do because they will do it on their own. They won't question. They'll just follow. And they'll think they question. They'll think that they are able to say yes or no to things. But ultimately, they'll follow because it's so much easier to follow the crowd than it is to be different. Okay, so ultimately, if you know your psychology and you want to be different yourself, you want to help other people to be able to resist this corporate, I don't know what you call it, entity that many people just call the New World Order, then you need to know how the mind works and therefore be able to employ strategies to confront it, or else you will be caught up in it, just like going down a stream or something, like you're going down the river at Niagara Falls. You may think that, okay, well, I can resist this on my own, when basically you turn the motor on your boat and barely make it before you go over the falls. The motor representing knowledge of these kinds of technologies. Well, anyway, that's the extent that we can go over that this afternoon or evening. I thank you for tuning in, and hope you'll come back next week for another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV.
In a Quinnipiac University national poll, a plurality of voters say President Barack Obama is the worst president since World War II. 33% of voters think the current president is the worst since 1945.
For more news, visit pigminenews.com.